Hi, everyone. So as introduced, I'm Andrew Bretano, co-founder and CEO of Tiny Farms. And we're here to talk about sustainability. And I'm here because of a grasshopper. So this is a grasshopper that I caught with my now wife on a sunny afternoon in October in Maine back in 2012. And we caught this grasshopper and a few others, and we put them in the freezer, and then we fried them up in a pan with a little butter, and we ate them. And they were delicious. They tasted like bacon-wrapped shrimp, and just like little lobsters, they turned from green to red when we cooked them. So you might be thinking, it's kind of a strange, random thing for you to do, to walk out in the yard, catch some grasshoppers and eat them. And to be fair to us in that moment, it also seemed like a kind of strange, random thing to do. But the reason we did that was sort of the culmination of an investigation that we'd been doing into how to improve the resiliency and sustainability of our food system. You see, we'd been looking into this topic, and we'd come across a small but pretty thorough body of research that suggested that insects could be a super efficient source of very high quality animal protein to help feed the world. So we're looking at these numbers on paper like, hey, this looks pretty good, but thinking to ourselves, there's a key question that any good food enthusiast asks: does it taste good? So the answer was a resounding yes, and naturally we decided that we would then dedicate our lives to trying to bring bugs to the mainstream palate. Now, in 2019, where we are right now, that might seem like, okay, that's kind of a reasonable thing to do with your lives. In 2012, things were a little different. In a room like this, the topic of bugs and foods would not have been very close to each other. At the time, our families, I think, probably were a little bewildered about what we were doing. We'd get on airplanes, and the person next to us would suddenly get very interested in their magazine after asking us what we were doing for a living. And one of my good friends actually gave me a lecture on the importance of nest eggs and how I might just be throwing my life away. But luckily for us, we weren't the only ones looking into this. And actually, the United Nations had also been researching this topic in depth. And in early 2013, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization released a massive 200-page report basically laying out the case for why we should be thinking about insects as food. This quickly became the most widely read UN report in history, and to date it's had over 10 million downloads. I highly recommend it. It's actually a pretty good read. So this kicked off a whole slew of media coverage, and it inspired entrepreneurs all over the world to start thinking about bugs as food. The logic behind this whole thing is pretty simple. All around the world, the demand for high-quality animal protein is growing rapidly. The problem is that traditional livestock production is the most resource-intensive thing that we do in agriculture. Just some quick stats up here. 23% of all the ice-free land on the earth is being grazed by animals, and 33% of all the croplands where we're growing commodities and such are being grown to feed animals. The UN also estimates that 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions are a direct result of meat production. And this practice is using trillions of gallons of fresh water every year. On the other hand, insects like crickets are incredibly efficient to produce. They require just a fraction of the land, the space, the water, and the feed that it takes to grow traditional livestock. And unlike big animals, they naturally live in these high-density little colonies. They love small, dark spaces, and they don't take up a lot of room to grow. So you can actually grow them just about anywhere. I mean, you could grow them in old warehouses, empty barns, even strip malls. The other great thing about insects, if you look at kind of the last thing over on the edge here about the greenhouse gases, they don't produce these huge quantities of noxious waste and methane emissions that you associate with traditional livestock rearing. And if you've ever driven down I-5 by Harris Ranch or by any big feedlot, you know what a big blessing that is for the environment and, of course, for anyone who lives near a potential farm. So besides the environmental, the sustainability of it, crickets are incredibly nutritious. They're packed with protein, they've got a complete amino acid profile, they're loaded with micronutrients like B12 and iron, calcium, and their fat profile is much more similar to olive oil than it is to like a traditional saturated animal fat. And it's not a new idea. Cultures around the world have been eating insects forever. The practice is particularly common in Mexico and in Thailand, where if you go down to street markets, it's easy to find big piles of fried grasshoppers and crickets. So here we are, we've got this idea. We know that, they taste good, they're good for you, and at least in a lot of the world, people eat them, so we can probably convince other people to eat them. But we had a real challenge, which was how do we make this a really scalable and sustainable supply chain that can actually produce a viable alternative to conventional meat products? Really, this, when we're thinking about it, we just had this stack of different design challenges that we're faced with. One of the first problems with this was, since we were here in the US and kind of dealing with the Western consumer, was how do we get over what's often called the ick factor, which is basically that US consumers don't necessarily want to pick up a fried grasshopper and pop it in their mouth, even though it's delicious. The solution to this turned out to be pretty simple. Basically, all we had to do was dehydrate the crickets or whatever insect and grind them into a simple powder that could then be used as an ingredient in any kind of normal, commonplace food product. So with that, it suddenly became very easy for folks to start launching all sorts of different food products using insect protein as a key ingredient. Initially, the traction was these products that could fit into an existing functional category in people's shopping carts that tasted good, that had good branding. The first ones to really take off were energy and protein bars. You can imagine the paleo crowd was an early adopter for all of this. And then more into healthy snack foods like chips. And now we've got everything from pastas that are fortified with cricket powder to bolognese sauce, and there's even a company making ice cream with bugs. And even the pet food industry has caught on. So having started to catch on in the food industry, pet food manufacturers are now making dog treats and other pet food products using crickets instead of traditional meat. When we got started, our initial idea was also that we were going to make one of these food products. It seemed to make sense. It was a lot of fun. We spent hours in the kitchen experimenting with different recipes. We actually came up with some pretty tasty products. But once we started thinking about how this was going to be a business, it suddenly became very clear that, hey, there's no supply. We can't actually make a product because there's nowhere to buy the key ingredient. So at that point, we shifted our focus to how you actually grow the things. And we focused on growing crickets. We've spent several years doing this now. And crickets have turned out to be essentially the most acceptable bug. We call it kind of the gateway bug that has the broadest appeal to the general consumer. The thing is, there's no guidebook for how to grow crickets. You can't call up your local ag extension office and say, hey, how do I get started in this? But we wanted to build a really scalable supply chain, and we knew it had to be easy for a new farmer to get up and running, get a cricket farm going, and supply the industry. So we've spent the last several years designing our own cricket farming system, where we're able to provide the ideal conditions for our crickets to grow throughout their life cycle in these big free-range habitats. And we've introduced some automation to help with giving them food and water throughout their life cycle. And ultimately, our vision is that we want to be able to package this into a turnkey solution that any new farmer who wants to get involved in the industry can come along and take, get up and running, and become a supplier. The cool thing particularly about this is that you can do it just about anywhere. Just to give you an example, I don't think that any of the employees or customers at this Ross have any idea that directly above their store, right where that arrow is pointing, we have a cricket farm. So this is a pretty, flexible thing. So now it's been several years, and you're probably wondering, so how's it going? The short answer is it's been going great. It's obviously there's, ups and downs along the way, but there's been some amazing research coming out that has shown that beyond just being a great protein source, crickets are actually qualified as a full-blown superfood. A recent study found that there's a positive prebiotic effect, which is basically helping improve the health of your gut biome, from eating a small amount of cricket protein every day. And they think this is from a special type of fiber that's in the cricket exoskeleton called chitin. Another cool study found that there's a whole bunch of highly active anti-inflammatory and antioxidant compounds found in roasted cricket powder. So this is really cool for us, because we're now not just talking about protein, but we're talking about kind of a whole health food. In general, the market's really been taking off. Over the last several years, we've gone from one or two products in a couple of health food stores to really widespread distribution. There's products all over the place. People really are starting to understand the benefits of this. New brands are popping up. Distribution is expanding. And there are actually hundreds and hundreds of people that contact us regularly who want to become cricket farmers, which is very exciting. So it's still relatively early days, but crickets are definitely taking off. And just a final example, just this year, our own crickets were featured at the Oakland A's Coliseum as a fried snack. And I think not coincidentally, the A's also had their best season in decades. So clearly, besides being good for you, they're also lucky. So I'd encourage you to add some lucky crickets to your diet this year. I look forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you.